For more than 4 decades, he moved through California's suburbs like a shadow no one could quite define. A whisper in the dark, a presence felt but never seen, a predator without a face and without a name. He studied routines with unsettling patience, not just doors and windows, but habits, schedules, quiet vulnerabilities. He waited for lights to go out, for televisions to dim, for neighborhoods to fall into complete and trusting silence. Then, without warning, he was inside, standing in the darkness of someone else's home, breathing slowly, listening carefully, controlling every second while his victims remained unaware that their safety had already vanished. Welcome to Unimaginable True Crimes. Here, we expose the unimaginable, one case at a time. Across California, the pattern repeated itself. Sacramento, Ventura, Orange County. Different cities, same method. Victims who never saw his face but would remember the terror for the rest of their lives. Police struggled to define him, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. Each jurisdiction gave him a different name, but the crimes carried the same signature: calculated, methodical, and always one step ahead of investigators. Years passed and the attacks suddenly stopped. No arrest, no public suspect, just silence. The kind of silence that leaves investigators unsettled and communities wondering if the nightmare is truly over. But the evidence never disappeared. Carefully sealed, cataloged, preserved in storage rooms and refrigerated lockers, biological samples that would outlive the headlines, waiting quietly for science to catch up. Decades later, forensic technology had transformed. DNA sequencing became faster, sharper, more precise. What once required guesswork could now reveal identity with mathematical certainty, even after 40 years. A new generation of investigators reopened the files with fresh determination. They weren't haunted by the same exhaustion of the original task force. They saw possibility where others once saw dead ends. This time, they weren't searching for fingerprints or eyewitness accounts. They were searching family trees, distant relatives who had unknowingly uploaded pieces of shared genetic code into public databases. One distant cousin led to another, third cousins, fourth cousins, branches spreading outward across decades of births, marriages, and migrations. Slowly, methodically, the circle narrowed around a single lineage. And finally, after months of genealogical reconstruction, one name surfaced above the rest: a former police officer living quietly in suburban California, Joseph James DeAngelo. He wasn't hiding in abandoned buildings or fleeing the country. He was mowing his lawn, shopping at local stores, living an ordinary life while carrying a secret buried for nearly 40 years. A husband, a father, a grandfather, a man neighbors described as quiet, sometimes irritable, but largely forgettable. The kind of man who blends into the background of suburban routine. On April 24, 2018, detectives moved in before sunrise. After decades of waiting, watching, and rebuilding the case from fragments, they surrounded his home and prepared to end the mystery. After 40 years of fear and unanswered questions, the Golden State Killer finally had a name, and the shadow that once haunted California was about to step into the light. But to understand how he was caught, how science reached backward through time, we have to return to the beginning, to the first night someone realized they were no longer alone. Back to Sacramento in 1976, back to a quiet street under a dim streetlight, back to the moment California first sensed that someone was watching and waiting. Northern California, 1976. Sacramento County was expanding rapidly. New subdivisions, young families, freshly paved streets. It felt like opportunity and stability, the kind of place where people believed danger belonged somewhere else. Most residents left windows cracked for evening air. Garage doors stayed open during dinner. Children rode bikes until sunset. Crime was something seen on television, not something that crept through quiet backyards. Then came the first reports of a prowler, someone slipping between fences after midnight, a shadow darting past bedroom windows. At first, it sounded like paranoia, until neighbors began reporting the same thing. A flashlight beam flickered through curtains. A gate once latched stood ajar. Footprints appeared in soft garden soil. Small signs, subtle, unsettling, that someone had been there. Soon, break-ins followed. Not dramatic burglaries, but calculated intrusions. Drawers opened, jewelry moved, personal items disturbed. It felt less like theft and more like someone proving they could enter unnoticed. Investigators realized these weren't crimes of opportunity. They were rehearsals. Someone testing boundaries, learning floor plans, measuring response times, preparing for something more deliberate. Then the attacks escalated. Young women awoke in the middle of the night to unfamiliar sounds. A creak in the hallway, a shifting shadow near the bedroom door. He didn't choose victims randomly. He studied them first, watched daily routines, noted who lived alone, memorized when lights turned off. His patience was as calculated as his entry. Some victims later recalled strange phone calls before their attacks. Silence, heavy breathing, a click. It was psychological warfare, fear planted long before he stepped inside. Police increased patrols and warned residents to lock doors, but the prowler adapted quickly. When one neighborhood tightened security, he shifted to another. By late 1976, fear had spread across Sacramento County. Community meetings filled church halls. Parents escorted children to school. The sense of safety began to fracture. Families installed stronger locks. Some men slept with weapons beside their beds. Nightlights stayed on. Yet beneath those precautions lingered a terrifying realization. Someone was still slipping through. He entered homes while couples slept, bound victims with shoelaces he sometimes brought himself. He controlled conversations, controlled movements, controlled time. Detectives began to recognize a pattern. The offender thrived on dominance. The break-ins were only part of it. The true objective was power. He lingered inside homes longer than necessary, ate from refrigerators, drank from kitchen glasses. Acts designed not for necessity, but for humiliation and control. Each attack followed a ritual, the same method of entry, the same threats, the same methodical calm. It was as if he were refining a routine. Then couples became primary targets. He forced them into compliance with threats of unseen accomplices. Fear became his most effective weapon. Victims later described his voice, controlled, sometimes whispering, sometimes angry. He claimed he would kill them if they resisted. The psychological terror often lasted longer than the physical assault. As the number of attacks climbed, media outlets gave him a name, the East Area Rapist. The label both warned the public and amplified the panic. But naming him did not stop him. If anything, the notoriety seemed to embolden the offender. He continued, adapting, always anticipating police movements. By late 1976, something shifted. The attacks moved south into different counties. The geography changed, and so did the violence. The pattern that began as burglary and assault was evolving into something darker, something irreversible. And California had no idea how much worse it would become. Before we continue, if you've been following this story so far, please take one moment to support the channel. Like this video, turn on notifications, and subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes. By 1979, the attacks had expanded into Southern California. The offender who once fled after assault was now staying longer. The escalation was unmistakable and far more lethal. In Goleta, near Santa Barbara, a young couple settled into bed on an ordinary evening. The doors were locked. The neighborhood was quiet. Nothing felt out of place. Sometime after midnight, a sliding glass door was quietly forced from its track. No alarms, no barking dogs, just a careful, deliberate entry. He moved through the house with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Step by step, room by room, calm, controlled. By morning, the couple was dead. The crime scene marked a terrifying evolution. This was no longer only sexual assault, it was homicide. Investigators realized they were dealing with something far more dangerous than previously understood. The East Area Rapist had become a serial killer. The media gave him yet another name, the original Night Stalker. The rebranding reflected a darker chapter and a growing sense of urgency. Between 1979 and 1981, murders followed a chilling rhythm along California's coast. Ventura County, Orange County, Santa Barbara, each crime eerily similar. He targeted couples in their homes, entered at night, bound them, separated control from chaos. The ritual remained consistent, only the outcome had changed. Neighbors occasionally reported strange metallic sounds or faint footsteps, but by the time police arrived, the intruder was gone. In some instances, he placed taunting calls to victims or even to police. The behavior suggested arrogance, a need to remind investigators he was still ahead. The killings were swift and brutal, often carried out with blunt force. There was little evidence left behind beyond the biological traces he could not see. Then, suddenly, in 1981, the murders stopped. No announcement, no final message, just silence. No suspect was arrested, no public breakthrough occurred. The task forces slowly dissolved as other cases demanded attention. Retirees retired, files were boxed, leads went cold. What once dominated headlines faded into memory. Families of victims were left with unanswered questions. Birthdays passed, anniversaries passed. Justice remained out of reach. Some investigators theorized the killer had died. Others believed he had moved away. A few feared he was still nearby, simply waiting. What remained consistent was the preserved DNA, carefully stored samples from multiple crime scenes, scientific fingerprints that would not degrade with time. Meanwhile, forensic science evolved rapidly. Techniques unimaginable in 1976 became standard practice by the 2000s. Investigators eventually discovered a critical detail. Joseph DeAngelo had once served as a police officer. He graduated from police academy training, wore a badge, understood patrol routines and evidence procedures. He knew how officers responded to burglary calls. He knew how crime scenes were processed. He understood the limits of 1970s forensic capabilities. That knowledge may have helped him evade capture for decades. He wasn't just studying victims, he was studying law enforcement. After 1981, DeAngelo appeared to settle into ordinary life. Marriage, children, steady employment, a quiet suburban existence. Neighbors described him as reserved, sometimes temperamental, but largely unremarkable. Nothing about him hinted at the scale of his past. For nearly 40 years, California carried unresolved grief. The crimes lingered in memory, but without resolution. Then in 2018, the case reopened with renewed determination. Investigators believed the answer had always been preserved in the evidence. The question was no longer whether they had DNA, but how to use it to finally attach a name to the genetic code.
In early 2018, investigators made a bold and unconventional decision. They would use public genealogy databases to search for partial DNA matches, not to find the suspect directly, but to find someone related to him. The uploaded DNA profile did not return a direct hit. Instead, it revealed distant relatives, people who shared fragments of genetic code, separated by generations of family history. Third cousins, fourth cousins, individuals who had never heard the name DeAngelo, yet unknowingly carried genetic breadcrumbs leading investigators closer to the source. Professional genealogists began reconstructing massive family trees. Census records, marriage certificates, birth announcements, decades of public documents carefully pieced together. The process required patience. Branches were built outward, then narrowed inward. Entire family lines were eliminated based on age, gender, or location. Investigators focused on males who would have been in their 20s or 30s during the late 1970s, men who lived in or near the affected counties.
one name consistently aligned with the timeline, geography, and profile. Joseph James DeAngelo, former police officer, resident of Citrus Heights. But suspicion alone would not secure an arrest. Detectives needed a direct DNA sample from DeAngelo to confirm what the genealogy suggested. Surveillance began quietly. Detectives monitored his daily routine, noting his habits, just as he once studied the routines of his victims. He rode his bicycle through the neighborhood, worked in his garage, retrieved mail. He appeared ordinary, aging, slower, unremarkable. On one April evening, investigators observed him discard items into his household trash bin placed at the curb. After he returned inside, officers retrieved the discarded bag legally from the public sidewalk. The contents were rushed to a forensic laboratory. Technicians extracted biological material from a discarded tissue. The process was precise, controlled, and methodical. The recovered sample was compared to preserved DNA evidence collected from multiple crime scenes decades earlier. The results were definitive. The genetic markers aligned perfectly. It was not a partial match, it was the same individual. 40 years of unanswered questions collapsed into a single confirmation. Science had identified the Golden State Killer. With probable cause established, prosecutors secured an arrest warrant. Surveillance intensified to ensure no opportunity for escape. Before sunrise on April 24, 2018, law enforcement officers surrounded DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights. When he stepped into his driveway, he was calmly detained. There was no chase, no resistance, just a quiet end to decades of pursuit. Handcuffs were secured. The former officer who once understood investigative procedure now faced it from the other side. News of the arrest spread rapidly across California and beyond. After decades of uncertainty, the Golden State Killer had a confirmed identity. For survivors and families of victims, the announcement felt surreal. A name had replaced a faceless terror. Joseph James DeAngelo, 72 years old, former Auburn police officer, accused of a crime spree that terrorized an entire state. Investigators revealed that he had lived within miles of several crime scenes, blending into communities he once invaded. The arrest was historic, but the legal process had only begun. Prosecutors now faced the complex task of presenting decades-old crimes in court. Detectives reopened archived files, reviewing every report, photograph, and forensic note to prepare for prosecution. Witness statements were revisited carefully. Some survivors were contacted again after decades of silence. For many, speaking with investigators reopened painful memories, but it also offered a chance to confront unfinished chapters. Investigators mapped every confirmed crime across California, revealing the full scope of the terror. The numbers were staggering. More than 50 sexual assaults and 13 murders attributed to one offender. Each preserved DNA sample confirmed the same conclusion. A single genetic fingerprint tied every major crime together. Prosecutors coordinated across multiple counties, consolidating charges into a unified case that reflected the scale of the crimes. Former colleagues from his police days were interviewed. Some expressed disbelief. Others acknowledged his temper and rigid demeanor. Records revealed that DeAngelo had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting, the same year the murders escalated. Behavioral analysts examined his patterns, noting the progression from burglary to assault to homicide. Audio recordings of past taunting calls were analyzed, compared against DeAngelo's later speech patterns. Even in custody, he remained largely silent. Investigators relied on evidence, not confession. The case assembled against him was built not on memory alone, but on preserved science, documented timelines, and genetic certainty.
For the first time, the fear that had gripped California in the 70s and 80s was matched by measurable proof. The Golden State Killer was no longer an unidentified predator. He was a defendant awaiting trial. Decades of investigative frustration had finally converged into one moment, the transformation of mystery into accountability. But the courtroom would determine how history would ultimately remember the man behind the crimes. Survivors prepared to speak, families prepared to listen, and the state prepared to seek justice. After 40 years, the investigation that once seemed impossible had reached its final chapter.
In August 2020, inside a Sacramento courtroom, Joseph James DeAngelo appeared before a judge to formally answer for crimes that had haunted California for more than 4 decades. Facing overwhelming DNA evidence and coordinated charges from multiple counties, DeAngelo agreed to plead guilty to dozens of offenses, including 13 counts of first-degree murder. The plea agreement removed the possibility of a death penalty trial, but ensured he would spend the remainder of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. One by one, survivors approached the courtroom podium. Some spoke steadily, others paused through emotion. Each voice carried decades of memory. They described nights interrupted by terror, relationships permanently altered, and a sense of safety that never fully returned after the attacks. Family members of those murdered spoke about birthdays missed, weddings unattended, and the quiet absence left at every holiday gathering. For hours, victim impact statements filled the courtroom. The testimony was not only about pain, but about resilience and survival. Throughout the proceedings, DeAngelo remained mostly silent, seated in a wheelchair, listening as the consequences of his actions were detailed publicly. Prosecutors carefully outlined how investigative genetic genealogy had identified distant relatives, narrowing the suspect pool until only one man fit the profile. They explained how discarded trash recovered from his home provided the direct DNA sample that conclusively matched preserved crime scene evidence. The scientific comparison was precise. Genetic markers aligned across multiple cases, linking assaults and murders spanning years and counties. After decades of speculation and fragmented theories, the identity of the Golden State Killer was no longer debated. It was documented in court. In a brief and controlled statement, DeAngelo addressed the court, offering an apology that many victims found measured and emotionally distant. For some survivors, the apology felt insufficient. For others, the formal conviction provided a measure of closure they had once believed impossible. On August 21, 2020, the judge delivered the final sentence, multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. With that ruling, the Golden State Killer's decades of evasion ended inside a courtroom rather than in the shadows. Families left the courthouse carrying mixed emotions, grief for the past, but relief that the man responsible would never walk free again. The case quickly became a landmark example of how preserved evidence and advancing technology can solve even the most enduring cold cases. Investigative genetic genealogy entered the national spotlight, sparking conversations about privacy, ethics, and the future of forensic science. But for those directly affected, the science was secondary. What mattered most was that the question of who had finally been answered. After sentencing, Joseph James DeAngelo was transferred into the California prison system to begin serving multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The man who once moved undetected through darkened neighborhoods now lived within a confined concrete cell under constant supervision and routine. For survivors, justice did not erase the trauma, but it marked an ending. The uncertainty that lingered for decades was finally replaced with accountability. Support networks strengthened in the aftermath of the trial. Survivors connected with one another, sharing stories that had once been carried in isolation. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the case closely, recognizing it as a turning point in modern forensic investigation. The use of public genealogy databases ignited national debate about privacy rights, informed consent, and the boundaries of investigative power. Some argued that solving violent crimes justified the method. Others cautioned that genetic data carries implications far beyond criminal justice. Yet for the families of victims, the scientific debate felt distant. What mattered most was the certainty, the confirmation of who was responsible. The name Golden State Killer remains etched into California's history, but it is no longer attached to anonymity. Communities that once lived in fear slowly reclaimed their sense of safety, knowing the offender would never return to the streets. The case demonstrated that time does not necessarily protect those who commit violent crimes. Evidence can wait patiently for technology to evolve. Cold cases once considered unsolvable were reopened nationwide, inspired by the precedents set in this investigation. Preserved DNA samples, archived files, and long-forgotten evidence boxes became renewed sources of possibility. Because sometimes justice is not immediate, but it is persistent. And even after 40 years, the truth can still find its way into the light. If this story held your attention, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation.